Very pleasant good evening to all of you tonight, and thank you for coming and being a part of our service and for braving the weather. Appreciate you being here. Those of you who are visiting and guests, I can just tell you as a guest myself that you are with some good people, and they will make you feel right at home very, very quickly. I should preach on Noah and the ark, I suppose. Whew, with all of the rain we've had today. And somebody said it's supposed to rain again tomorrow. So you all have just done well to make your way around this evening in the dark and in the cold and in the rain, and I appreciate that so much. And I appreciate our song leader tonight leading that song, The Land of Unclouded Day. And after a day like today, I think I'd appreciate that, wouldn't you? Turn in your Bibles tonight, if you will, to 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1. That's where I want to start this evening. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1. Therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all defilement of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. It's that last phrase in that verse, perfecting holiness in the fear of God, that I want you to hang on to. In fact, if you've got something to mark your Bible with or underline that particular phrase at the end of that verse, please do so. Some translations render that, let us perfect holiness out of reverence for God. Now, I want you to hold on to that thought because we'll come back there in just a moment. We'll call his name Greg. Greg walked to his car. He hit the button on the keypad to unlock his door, and nothing happened. He hit it again, and nothing happened. The door locks didn't work. Now, he was able to take his key and manually get in the car the old-fashioned way, but when he did, it didn't start. His gas gauge read empty, although he had filled up the tank that very morning. And as he began to look around the vehicle, he began to notice nothing in this car is working. And so they towed the vehicle to the dealership. The mechanic came back with a diagnosis in a little bit and said, Greg, you've got a bad BCM. It stands for the Basic Control Module. And just sort of think of it as the brain of your car. And if the basic control module goes bad, nothing in your car is going to work. Now, Greg could have insisted, no, I want you to fix my door locks, and I want you to fix my remote control, and I want you to fix my gas gauge, and I want you to fix all of the individual things that aren't working. But Greg was smart enough to understand that all of those things that weren't working were simply symptoms of a much bigger problem. You know, when it comes to marriage, I wonder how often we focus only on the symptoms instead of the basic control module. Here is a couple, and they sit down and they say to me or to somebody else, you know, we're struggling in our marriage. We need to improve communication. Well, okay, probably so, but that's a symptom. Another couple sits there and says, you know, we need to get better at handling conflict one with the other, conflict resolution. Well, okay, but that is a symptom. Somebody else says, you know, we need to show more appreciation to one another. We need to show more affection to one another. Okay, but that's a symptom. And we can spend all of our time focusing on all of the symptoms when maybe our focus needs to be on the basic control module. And the basic control module for the Christian is a spiritual focus. It is a spiritual motivation. It is 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1. Let us perfect holiness out of reverence for God. I don't know what you think that verse means, but I'll tell you what I think it means. I think what that verse means is that God is to come first in every part of our lives. Now here's my question. Is marriage exempt from that? Or is marriage included in that? It all comes down to this. Either you are going to be a God-centered spouse, or you will be a spouse-centered spouse. It'll be one of the two. A spouse-centered spouse will act nice toward her husband as long as he acts nice toward her. A spouse-centered spouse will go out of his way for his wife as long as she remains agreeable and affectionate. But does it ever dawn on us that maybe God demands more from us than that? Paul said, listen, we are to perfect holiness in our lives out of reverence for God. In other words, the number one motivating factor in every part of our lives, in everything we do, including this very, very special, albeit brief, earthly relationship called marriage, is reverence for God. You know, sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we think about marriage that way. I think it's easy for us to kind of compartmentalize it and put it over here when it needs to be right here. I am not called to love my wife because she is holier than anybody else. That's not it. I'm not called to love my wife because she always makes me perfectly happy. I am not called to love my wife because things between us are always so wonderfully ooey and gooey and romantic 24/7, 365. I am called to love my wife out of reverence for God. Period. Let us perfect holiness in every part of our life out of reverence for God. Every decision I make, every attitude I have needs to flow from this one singular holy motivation. Is this something that honors God? So back to my original question. When it comes to marriage and various issues we all face, are we just treating the symptoms? Or are we working on our basic control module? So let me talk to you for a few minutes tonight about sacred marriage. In all of my reading on this subject, there's one quote that is my all-time favorite, and I share it with you tonight. It's by Socrates. Remember Socrates? Listen to his quote. By all means, get married. If you get a good wife, you'll be happy. If you get a bad wife, you'll become a philosopher. Think about that. Why didn't God design this marriage thing? Why didn't He design this to be easier than it often is? I mean, it sounds easy. If you're on the outside looking in, it looks easy. My wife went to a wedding not too long ago, and she said, the bride's in the receiving line, and Julie's going through the line, and she reaches to Lisa and gives her a big hug, and Lisa hugs her, and said, Lisa looked at me and said, "Whew, I'm glad the hard part's over." And you can imagine what my wife said to her. We're big fans of Jeannie Robertson, the comedian. We heard her down in Montgomery here not too long ago, and Jeannie Robertson said, have you ever wanted to just take the face of a young person and just hold them by the face and say, are you in there? Are you in there? Honey, the hard part is just getting started. Anybody fan of the Hallmark Channel that wants to admit it? Huh? Yeah, great, fine. Our 17-year-old, she's discovered the Hallmark Channel, and she loves to curl up on Sunday afternoon with a blanket and a fireplace and watch those Hallmark movies. And I hate to blow it for her, just like I hate to blow it for all of you. So if you're a fan of the Hallmark Movie Channel, cover your ears, because I'm fixing to blow it for you. They're all the same. Every movie on that channel is the same. 4 things. There's a beautiful couple that meet under improbable conditions. They fall in love. They fall out of love. And the last 15 minutes, they fall back in love. The end. That's it. And if it's in the wintertime around Christmas, they always end with a kiss and the snow starts falling. Every single time. And those movies make marriage look so easy. It's not easy. And I'll tell you why it's not easy. It's not easy because romantic love has little elasticity. You can't take romantic love and stretch it very far, because when you try to stretch romantic love, it's going to shatter. Because romantic love tends to be all about me. What are you doing for me? Mature love, on the other hand, holy love, God's love, stretches further than anybody ever thought it could. It has to. Because when 2 sinful, selfish people come together and live as one, there's going to be trouble. Unless each one coming into the relationship embraces a higher motivation. And that's reverence for God. You ever think that maybe God has a higher purpose when it comes to matrimony than 2 people just living together and sharing the same mailbox and sharing the same kitchen table and sharing the same bedroom? Do you ever stop and think that maybe, just maybe, it's not your happiness He has in mind in this relationship that comes to the forefront as much as it is your holiness? Your holiness. I'm not saying happiness and holiness are mutually exclusive. I'm not saying that. I'm saying when you look at your relationship through the lens of God's purpose, suddenly you get a whole new perspective. And suddenly it dawns on you, wow, this isn't all about me. Because I'll tell you what I think the real purpose of marriage is all about. Is to help me draw closer to Him. Is to help me draw closer to the one who has brought us together. You see, my relationship with my God is going to outlast my relationship with my spouse. Here's my relationship with my spouse, time-wise. Here's my relationship with God. I hope you know that. I hope you understand that. And that's why just working on all of these symptoms in the long run is not going to work very well. Now, you can try to make your home more pleasant and peaceful. You should do that. You can try to look for ways to keep the spark and the romance alive, and you should do that. You can work on showing respect and courtesy and kindness and patience, and you should do all of those things. But if your relationship with God is not what it ought to be, then we spend our time going around putting Band-Aids on symptoms. The problem sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, we look for something in another human being that ultimately and eternally only God can provide. That's why marriage dissatisfaction, in my opinion, runs so high, because sometimes we expect way too much. My first computer, this will date me, and probably will date some of you. My first computer was an old 486. Anybody remember the 486 computers? Huh? We were in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. a couple years ago, and in the Museum of American History, and there was a 486 computer. And our youngest son, who was still at home at the time and kind of a smart aleck, said, "Hey, Dad, look at there. There's your computer." You know you're getting old when your stuff is showing up in the Smithsonian. But anyway, it's like trying to run today's programs on an old 486. It's not going to work. It's not that the old 486 was a bad computer. In its day, it was the top of the line. But today, you would be trying to ask it to do more than it could possibly do, to give you more than it can possibly give. And maybe sometimes we do the same thing when it comes to marriage. In other words, if you're seeking the largest proportion of your life fulfillment from your spouse, you're asking too much. Because you and I were created with a craving to have an eternal relationship with our Creator. And your wife isn't God, and your husband isn't God, and only God can fill that eternal craving in your soul. He's the only one who can. Now, when you finally get that, when you finally understand that, there's your basic control module. When you finally get that, then and only then will you have a new appreciation for this person with whom you have embarked this very special journey called marriage. I don't know how often, or how if you've noticed or not, how often the Scriptures talk about and connect God's relationship with us, or God's relationship with people, to marriage. He does that, I think, so we can understand it better. But he does it constantly, Old and New Testament. In Isaiah 62 and verse 5, he talks about, as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so God rejoices over you. That's God's attitude toward his people. In Matthew chapter 9 and verse 15, Jesus even referred to himself as the bridegroom. In Matthew 22, verse 1 and following, he compares the kingdom of heaven to a wedding banquet. In Revelation 19 and verse 7, he talks about the wedding of the Lamb, and here is the bride who has made herself ready. He uses all of these marriage wedding terms. And what's really interesting, in the Old Testament, when God talked about the breakdown of spiritual fidelity among the children of Israel, he put it in terms of marital infidelity so we could understand how much it hurt God. Passages like Jeremiah 3 and verse 8. Listen carefully. I gave Israel her divorce, and I sent her away because of her adulteries. And that happens again and again and again in Scripture. But perhaps no place is the sacredness of marriage seen with greater clarity than in Ephesians, the 5th chapter. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 22 through verse 33, where holy matrimony is compared to the holy union between Christ and the church. You want to talk about the sacredness of marriage? He says in verse 25 of Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. Verse 29, no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. Verse 31, for this reason a man shall leave father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Verse 32, this mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. How can you read passages like that and not come away with a higher appreciation for the sacredness of marriage? With a greater appreciation for the fact that it is God who puts the holy in matrimony. Let me give you another passage. In 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 9. Paul writes and he says, therefore, we also have as our ambition, this is our life goal, this is our life ambition. What is it? whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to Him. Paul says, when I think about the goal of life, the whole goal of life, he says, is to live pleasing to Him. Oh, by the way, is marriage exempt from that? Or would marriage be included in that? In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 31, he says, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Is marriage exempt from that? Or is marriage included in that? Look in verse 15. He died for all, so that they who live might no longer live for themselves, but live for Him. Is marriage exempt from that? Or is marriage included in it? You see what God's doing? God is demanding that I look at my life and that I look at the relationship that I have with my spouse, and He is demanding that I look at it through the lens of His perspective. He wants me to see things as He sees things. And what He is telling me is, your marriage, like everything else in your life, your marriage is not about your happiness, and your marriage is not about your glory. Your marriage, He says, is about mine. It's about bringing honor to me. You ever thought about it that way? Come on down to verse 18. We're still in 2 Corinthians 5. Here's another verse. Now all these things are from God, who reconciled us to Himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. I think in the passage, Paul specifically, if you want to get specific, I think Paul specifically here is talking about the Great Commission. I think he's talking about the Great Commission that Christ gave to the apostles to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. I get that. I understand that. But let's back up for a moment. Is not the very core of the gospel, is not the very work of the church the ministry of reconciliation, in the sense that our message is to share the good news that man can be reconciled to God through the death of Jesus on the cross? You say, well, what does that have to do with marriage? I thought we were talking about marriage. We are. Look closely at the word reconciled. Do you ever hear the word reconciled used in regard to marriage? Maybe let me rephrase that. Have you ever heard reconciled, or maybe the word irreconcilable, used in regard to divorce? Irreconcilable differences. What's the point? The point is, if our homes are fraught with fighting and animosity, and as the song we just sang, angry words, then guess what? My marriage just contradicted my message. And if my marriage contradicts my message, I have sabotaged the goal of my life. And the goal of my life, Paul says in verse 9, is to live pleasing to Him. And the goal of my life, he says, is to share the message of reconciliation with other people. You see, ladies and gentlemen, a marriage that honors God, that is dedicated to the reverence of Him, puts flesh on the picture of reconciliation. Because a marriage that honors God is going to be one that models forgiveness and selfless love and sacrifice. And what do you think are the very basics of reconciliation? If it's not those three things, forgiveness and selfless love and sacrifice. What I'm saying to you is, what we do in the home as husbands and wives every day, regularly, in the area of forgiveness and selfless love and sacrifice, is a little tiny taste of what God has done for us and continues to do for us. Do you ever think about marriage this way? Your marriage will either be a stumbling block to the gospel or a stepping stone to it. can I tell my kids that God's promise of reconciliation is sound and secure if they see that their daddy's promises don't mean one thing? Now, there's an exception to that. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 18, Paul said, as far as it depends upon you, be at peace with all men. And so you learn a very hard life lesson sometimes, that in life there's only one person you can control, and that's you. And if you have a spouse who is bound and determined to be morally unfaithful, do you know what you can do about that? Nothing. And Jesus talks about that in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9, and how that God allows unfaithfulness to break the bonds of holy matrimony, and the innocent one to put the other away. But not as a first response, not as a knee-jerk reaction, but as a last resort. As we answer the question, what would God want me to do? I had a lady tell me one time, she said, I don't believe there's any such thing as an innocent party. Well, take that up with Jesus. But secondly, what she really means by that, I think, is there's no such thing as a perfect party. Well, that's true. But it's not about perfection. It never is. It is about what can I do in my life to glorify God. It's about answering one singular question, whether it is on this subject or any other subject. What is it that God would want me to do? And I can answer that question. What God would want me to do is to do everything within my power to reconcile. But sometimes that's not possible, because the only person you can control is you. Here's my point in all of this. We live in a culture where relationships, with marital relationships, are just thrown away and discarded with regularity. Where people make promises with no intention to fulfill them. Where people get with their peer groups and they bash their spouses right and left. I'm going to tell you, a Christian who works hard to maintain this God-glorifying relationship, that Christian and that couple are going to command attention, because our lives and our relationships and our marriages can become platforms of evangelism, where we can either lead others to Christ or push them further away. How many of you have been married 30 years? Raise your hand. Anybody got any 30-year people? 30 years. 40. 50. 60. 70. 100. I did that because I don't remember where I was, and I was doing that, and there was a guy sitting back in the back, and he kept raising his hand. 70, 80, 90, 100. He raised his hand on 100. And I stopped and I said, "You've been married 100 years?" He said, "No, but it sure feels like it." And I thought to myself, I wouldn't want to be in your car on the way home, buddy. Woo! You know, it is easy for young people, and it's easy for young married couples to look at people who've been married 30, 40, 50, 60 years and beyond and think, well, maybe their lives have been easier than ours. No, they haven't. They've gone through a lot of stuff too. And I want to tell you what their message is. These people are living testimonies to the power of God's love and the power of forgiveness and the power of reconciliation. These folks are living the gospel message itself. Now, there's one more thing I'll leave you with, that maybe you haven't thought about marriage in this way either. Do you realize when you got married that you married a child of God? If you married a Christian, you married a child of God, which means that your spouse is not just your spouse. Your spouse is God's daughter, Your spouse is God's son. Your spouse is God's child. Now, I think I know what you know, and that is, if you want to get on the good side of a parent, then be good to their kids. On the other hand, if you want to make a parent mad and angry, then you start picking on their kid. You start picking on that child, and you're mean and you bully them. And you'll fire up righteous parental indignation in a hurry. It's the same with God. Zechariah 2 and verse 8 says, "He who touches you touches the apple of his eye." Here is a point that I think would revolutionize our relationships if we would only get the point. You married a child of God. So it's not just about me and an attitude that I have toward this other person over here. It is about me and an attitude that I have toward a daughter of God. You know, we spend time talking about the fatherhood of God and that analogy. Jesus taught us to pray, "Our Father who art in heaven." Well, if God is the father of the woman that I marry, then in a sense he sort of becomes like my father-in-law. All of which says, if I don't respect my wife, and I demean her, and I mistreat her, and I speak condescendingly towards her, then I'm going to court trouble with him. Peter says that in 1 Peter 3 and verse 7. He says, "Husbands, show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers be not hindered." I think most of us fail to grasp how passionate God is to the person we marry. Our first 4 children are all married and grown, and we rejoice with them all. And I've always prayed that my kids would marry someone who would love them as much as I do. But I will tell you something about all 4 of these children. Each of them falls short. Each of them has quirks. Each of them have limitations. Each of them makes mistakes. And so my prayer is that they would have a spouse who would be kind, who would be forgiving, who would be patient. I would cringe to think that any of them would marry somebody who would be cruel to them, who would abuse them in some way, who would hurt them and mistreat them. Now, think about your spouse. God is fully aware that your spouse has limitations too. That your spouse has quirks, that your spouse isn't perfect. God knows all of that too. So here's the deal. He wants you to be as forgiving and patient with their faults as you would want your kids' spouses to be with them. So think about that. And think about how you've treated your spouse in recent days. Is that how you would want your daughter treated by her spouse? Is that how you would want your son treated by his spouse? I tell couples sometimes, you know that ring on your left hand? That represents a lot. Because it is a message to me that I didn't just marry any woman out there. I married a daughter of God. I married a child of God. And every day, God is watching to see how I treat His precious child. My wife is a great cook. And I want you to know that before I tell you this story, because you're going to think I'm throwing her under the bus. I'm not doing that, because she's a fantastic cook. And I don't remember the occasion, but it was several years ago, and there was some occasion. And she said, "I'm going to fix this big dinner." And I think Luke and I went out and played golf that day. She said, "When you guys come back home, we're going to really do it up, and we're really going to celebrate big tonight." So we went out and did our thing, played golf, came back, and sure enough, she'd cooked this fantastic meal. We sat there, we finished. She said, "Leave enough room for dessert." She said, "Because I've made a chocolate pie." And I looked over there on the counter, and there's this chocolate pie, and it was one of those chocolate pies that looked fake, because the meringue on the top was just perfect. And so we began to clear the table, and she said, no, boys, guys, sit here. I'll take care of it. Let me do it. So she got the plates up. She went over there, and she cut me a piece of chocolate pie, and she set it down in front of me. Now, you have to know something about my wife. Bless her heart, she is a stickler on manners, and it is ingrained in us, all of us, that in cases when there's dessert being served, you wait until everybody is served, and then you wait for the hostess to sit down, and then you eat your dessert. So I'm seated there, and I've got this piece of great-looking chocolate pie in front of me, and she's over in the kitchen cutting Luke a piece. And I took the tip of my fork, and I dipped it into a little bit of that chocolate. That doesn't count. And so I took a little bit of that chocolate, and I dipped it, and I put it on my tongue. And I'm going to tell you something. That was the worst tasting stuff I had ever put in my mouth. It was horrible. And I realized she didn't put any sugar in this thing. It is bad. I mean, it looked good, but it was bad. And I started to say something. And I thought, no, sir, I have a high school senior kid sitting here, and I know the kind of bites he takes. I'm going to sit back and watch this show. And she says, she served Luke. She said, dig in, boys, dig in. Go ahead, enjoy. And I watched that boy take that fork, and he got him a big old bite, stuck it right in his mouth. And I watched those eyes get big, and I mean, the water just started down here. His cheeks all got puffy. And I mean, he spewed chocolate pie all over the place. Well, Julie's aghast. So, what in the world is wrong? And so she takes a bite of it herself, and she goes, oh no. And she reached out to grab my plate, and she reached out to grab Luke's plate. And I said, no, leave him. She said, you're not eating this. I said, leave him. And I looked at Luke, and I winked. And I whispered, just do what I do. And I took my fork, and I scraped off that meringue. And I'm going to tell you people something. In Birmingham, Alabama, my wife makes the best meringue pie you have ever put in your mouth. And I think about that night a lot when I talk about marriage, because we get married thinking every day is just going to be sugary sweet and everything's just going to be perfect. No, it's not. There's going to be some hard times. There's going to be some bitter moments. There's going to be some ups and downs. But there's going to be some days when you just eat the meringue and thank God for it and appreciate this person with whom you walk this very special journey. Thank you for listening tonight. This is not your typical lesson on marriage. But maybe we brought out some verses and some passages that you haven't thought about before that I think connect very, very well with why we need to think of it as sacred marriage. We sing the song of invitation tonight. If you're not a Christian, why don't you give your life to Jesus? Be buried in baptism for the remission of your sins, and then be determined to walk and be faithful to Him. And there's people here who will help you do that. If you owe a duty to God in any way tonight that we can help you with, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing together.